In this video, I'm going to introduce some of the possible areas of study that you can use solvers for on your own. And there's a lot of different things that you can use solvers for. We've already seen that we can use solvers to look at preflop scenarios, flop scenarios, turn scenarios, river scenarios. We can also look at things at a very macro level, and we can be more granular and study things at the more micro level. There's really a lot of different potential projects that you can do using solvers. And as an explorer of this game, I find myself diving into a lot of different rabbit holes in my own study. You can go to what interests you when you're using solvers for study purposes, but it's useful to frame things into particular problems that you're actually trying to solve. So I'm going to give you a few ideas that you potentially can take and run with as an example of questions that you might want to explore a little bit further, or answers that you might want to find using solvers. Using this framework, maybe we might want to analyze preflop scenarios using solvers. Now we can do so at the macro level or micro level. Starting at the macro level, we might use solvers to try to find adjustments of our own preflop ranges to potentially account for aggressive players to our left. We've all been in that game where we keep getting 3-bet from a player to our left, or every single time that we happen to call a hand from another player's open, we get squeezed by a player to our left. Those tend to be frustrating scenarios, and what we can do through various forms of node locking and various solver configurations, we can use solvers to make assumptions about that 3-betting range of the player to our left and identify how we might alter either our flatting range, our opening range, or our potential back 4-betting range to counter that strategy of the player to our left. At the micro level, we might try to find a specific answer of a preflop range that's profitable to shove in a particular ICM situation. If you play tournaments, you end up in these scenarios a lot where we might be closer to a bubble of a tournament or reaching the final table bubble of a tournament, and ICM tends to be a little bit more significant in our decision-making processes. Ranges are going to differ very, very significantly from when scenarios where ICM is not necessarily as big of a factor in our decision-making process. So we can use solvers to find preflop ranges that are profitable to shove in those particular scenarios, and that's kind of a micro-level use case. Moving forward to the flop, and this is an area where I've spent a ton of time, at that macro level, we can start trying to categorize different flop textures and develop strategies that can be implemented across different flop types. There's 22,100 different flops, of which 1,755 of them are strategically different. Trying to develop a strategy for all 1,755 boards is going to be, quite frankly, impossible to do, especially when you start layering in the fact that we have a lot of different formations or ways in which we can reach those flops. Categorizing different flop textures into like groups of flops can help us kind of simplify those strategies and get things down to a more manageable level that we can actually learn and remember and implement in game. And we can use solvers to help kind of guide those analyses. At the more micro level, we've already touched on some node locking examples in some of the previous videos, but developing an exploitable counter strategy to common player pool flop strategies. So an example of this is a lot of players will just choose to bet all of range for a third pot on a lot of different boards, and they'll just continuation bet everything for a third pot. Well, by knowing that piece of information, we can node lock that and as an assumption for our opponent's range and develop counter exploits for that particular strategy and use that when we're in game. Moving forward to turns, maybe we might, at the macro level, use solvers to develop exercises to group different turn card types together. So maybe we might look at brick turn types, or flush completing turns, or board pairing turns, or etc. And understand the effect that those different turn cards types have on the overall strategies with which we might take with our overarching ranges on various turns. We can also, at the more micro level, conduct some sort of node locking analysis to understand how we should be adjusting turn play based on our opponent's probable imbalances. So maybe making assumptions that our opponent continuation bets too much on the flop and arrives at a turn with a wider range than he or she should. Or maybe our opponent calls too tightly on the flop and ends up with a kind of more condensed, stronger range in the turn than he or she should. But having those assumptions, we can use node locking to ultimately figure out how we might adjust our turn play from what we would typically expect to, given that those particular scenarios. And then finally, on the river play, at the more macro level, we can start putting an analysis together to try to identify some profitable bluffing situations on rivers by analyzing the types of cards that tend to yield range imbalances, because those are the scenarios where maybe an opponent has too much value in their range or is devoid of all value in their range, and identifying which of the cards that we want to be shutting down on more frequently versus which of the cards that we want to be bluffing with a larger portion of our range. And then finally, at the micro level, within a river analysis, we might want to perform an analysis to understand the various hands that we can likely call profitably against our opponent's assumed betting range. A very specific scenario, we can even think back to the equilibrium exercise from a few videos back. What are the hands that we can actually call versus what we think our opponent is actually betting with, and making some adjustments based off of if they're betting 10% wider than we thought they would, or 10% tighter than we thought they would, and how that might impact the overall hands with which we should be calling. And really, like, at the end of the day, these are just 8 specific examples. There are endless examples that we could have here, whether we use this framework or a different type of framework. And as I've mentioned before, like, you can study poker for a lifetime and barely scratch the surface of its complexity. So at the end of the day, really explore what you're interested in. And for best results using solvers, just identify what those areas are and develop focused study plans to explore its depth. Because yes, you can study everything, but I've at least found from my own experience, it's much more rewarding and much more profitable to develop those focused plans of study, find the areas that are interesting to you and or the areas that might plug the leaks that you have in your game, and focus on developing a very detailed study plan to attack those individual areas. And that's where you're going to end up getting the most success. In the next video, which is the final video of this module, I'm going to wrap up all of the main concepts that we've talked about and really kind of set the stage for the rest of this course as we close out this initial foundational concepts video. So I'll see you there, and thanks for joining so far.